So next up we have Adela Buliman. Adela is a quality assurance manager, and she is going to give a talk on how digitally accessible is Northern Ireland. So welcome, Adela, to the stage. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming to my talk. My name's Adela, and as my introduction said, I'm an accessibility QA manager in Inclusion and Accessibility Labs. For anyone that can't see me, I'm 24, white, female presenting. I have a blue top on and some stripy Beetlejuice bottoms on. And my talk today is about how digitally accessible Northern Ireland is. So we led a bit of research this year into digital accessibility and kind of how it's faring across important sectors across Northern Ireland. So I'm going to start talking about accessibility in general, and then I'm going to move into the kind of findings of the report. And for context, Inclusion and Accessibility Labs, we're a manual kind of auditing digital accessibility company. Okay, so I'll go from the very beginning with what is accessibility. So accessibility is a design practice where services, products, tools, environments are all made for as many people as possible, including people with disabilities. Globally, about 1 in 7 people live with a disability, which is just over 1 billion people worldwide, and we do estimate that this is quite a bit higher. There's a lot of people that maybe don't want to admit that they have a disability. I think everyone has that great aunt who has a TV up to about 100 and will not get hearing aids. That's the kind of group of people that we're estimating it's higher for. And then in Northern Ireland, there's about 1 in 5 people living with a disability, according to the Department of Communities. Other research says that about 22% of people working age in Northern Ireland have a disability, and of course that would be higher if they included children and people who are retired as well. Most people understand accessibility in the kind of physical world. So, you know, all public sector buildings are going to have lifts. There's when you go to cross a road at like a traffic light, you have those little bumps on the ground, and that's so someone who's visually impaired would know that the end of the street is coming up. You know, large signage, things like that. There's loads of accessibility around us, and in terms of physical accessibility, it's pretty good. Like all state bodies would have pretty accessible buildings. And digital accessibility applies the same kind of thinking to the internet. So it's these kind of metaphorical ramps that we're applying to our code to make it compatible with all kind of assistive technologies that exist out there. And of course, technology is really, really essential to communicating, especially nowadays, and I think especially after COVID. If you can imagine how horrible online meetings were for people with hearing loss, if you had a visual impairment and your doctor doesn't let you kind of book online or call in anymore, you have to, you have to do all these things online. Suddenly we weren't able to go into places and talk to someone in real life. And then if those websites aren't accessible, which for the most part they are not, most websites worldwide are not accessible, that you're just removing so much access and so much independence from 1 billion people all over the world. So COVID especially hard, and digital accessibility still really, really catching up with the kind of technological revolution that we're in. I'm going to speak about the kind of common technology barriers for people with disabilities. I want to point out firstly that there are so many pieces of technology out there, incredible things, and regardless of what senses or abilities people have or don't have, there is a piece of technology out there that will enable them to use the internet and interact with, digital documents, websites, mobile apps, And when I'm speaking about barriers now, it is the complete onus is on the creators of that software, those websites, in not making them compatible. For instance, like someone who's fully blind would maybe use something called a screen reader. And in fairness, before I started in this job, I didn't know that blind people could use phones, but they can. And it's usually through the use of something called a screen reader, which is a text-to-speech engine. And it will literally read out exactly what is on a website. Like for this, it would say title or heading level 1, common technology barriers for people with disabilities. You would use your down arrow and it would say Inclusion and Accessibility Labs logo. And you would move through and you'd be able to use your space bar to click links and so on. But I would have had to set that as a title, not just normal text, and I would have had to put alt text on that logo for them to get any of that information. So that's what I mean by you have to code things to make them accessible, and you have to tag things to give that accessibility. There's 5 kind of main groups of disability, and I'm just going to point out some of the barriers that they would face. So I mentioned kind of screen readers, and people with kind of low vision or sight loss might use a screen reader. So obviously images without alt text, it's going to be a big barrier because you literally have no idea if it's important or not. It could be like a silly image just there to look pretty, but they don't know. I think if I was looking, asking about car loans and someone was telling me about them and then they were like, oh, there's a little bit of information here. I'm not going to tell you what it is, though. I'd be like, ooh, do I want this car loan? And that's how people with using screen readers would feel as well. If you don't know what the image is, you don't know if it's important or not, and that's going to completely alter your ability to interact with the information that you've seen on that webpage then. Even websites that can't be used with screen readers. So screen readers are keyboard only. Obviously, if you need a screen reader, you're not going to see where the cursor is going. And that is a really, really, really common issue because even if you have like a navigation menu and there's some sort of drop down and you have to bring your mouse up and hover on it, all of a sudden you are removing all the other links past the homepage for someone using a screen reader. They cannot access those links because you can't use your keyboard to drop down those menus. We have deaf and hard of hearing as well. So obviously things like videos without subtitles, online meetings without a text transcript, any sort of audio recordings. Even if you have somewhere on a site that's like, oh, if you need help with this, call us. I feel like banks do that a lot. They're like, oh, if you lose your card, give us a ring on this number. If you can't hear, you can't cancel that card then. And it's one of the easier ones to get right as well. Because even things like YouTube, you can, upload them to YouTube, embed it on your site, and all of a sudden there's automated captions, there's an automatic text transcript, and it's not 100% accurate, but you're giving something, and it's something that costs no money to do, compared to getting subtitles embedded. But that's quite an easy way to add accessibility. We have physical disabilities as well, so a lot of people might use keyboards or voice controls. It's going to be similar to screen readers, where if you need a mouse to do something, any sort of drag and drop, validating or authenticating payments on Bank of Ireland, like anything like that, you're removing that access and that independence from all people with mobility issues that might not be able to actually move things so specifically. Even timeouts and multi-factor authentication. So that kind of, you have 90 seconds to do this. It might just take someone longer than 90 seconds to do something. So if you're going to have a timeout, maybe incorporate some sort of refresh, some alert that says, do you want to keep this session open? And you're allowing people a little extra time if they need it. Even as far as intellectual disabilities, things like flashing content, animations that can't be paused. I hate carousels anyway, but they're also really inaccessible. I know all the any content editors or managers here are going to love the fact that they can get 20 images into one page, but please just add a button that you can pause it with, because it's going to really mess up screen reader focus, keyboard focus, and if you have any sort of intellectual disabilities, that's going to be super disorientating to see something just like flick in the corner of your eye every so often. Also things as simple as kind of idioms, jargons, abbreviations. If you're using anything like that, you should really add maybe a link to a definition or something like that. I think across UK and Ireland, about 15% of adults are completely illiterate or have a very, very basic level of literacy. You also have people who like English is not their first language. So you really want to keep your language as simple as possible so that everyone can understand it. Things like text with poor color contrast as well. There's a lot of people that affects. You have people with low vision who might see things very, very difficult or differently. Even dyslexia, color contrast is really, really going to help. My last point there is forms that only use color. So, when you're signing up for something and you've left something out of your email and it glows red, if you are using a screener, if you can't see that red, first of all, because actually I think 1 in 12 men have color blindness, you're not going to really know there's an error there. If you've cognitive issues, you might not understand what that means. If you even have dyslexia, it's not telling you anything in terms of like what you might be missing, and you might not be able to see that typo. So having some sort of message under there with like some instruction, like email requires this format, password needs whatever letters, that's going to be a massive help as well in terms of error validation. So technology and disabilities. I kind of already spoke about the different technologies out there, but one of my favorites is a refreshable braille display. So this is something that you would use if you say you were both deaf and blind, because you wouldn't be able to hear a screen reader, so you can't use that. But you can get these they almost look like keyboards, but they have digital braille that pops up, and you can move to a website and the braille just refreshes, and you can interact fully with a website. That is one of my favorite pieces of technology because it has brought an immense amount of independence to people. I was speaking to someone who was deaf and blind, and he was saying that about 30 odd years ago, there was at least in the Republic of Ireland, there was only 2 schools in Dublin if you had a disability. So if you couldn't leave your family because you had maybe mobility issues too, or you didn't have the money or you didn't want to, you kind of just didn't really get an education. But now he has this kind of digital refreshable braille display. He connects it to his iPhone. He gets in the instructions from Google Maps to go to his favorite pub, types in, is there chicken and chips on the menu? That says it out loud through his iPhone. The waitress then speaks into the iPhone and it pops back up in braille again. So an incredible piece of technology, and there's so many websites that he can't use because they're not compatible with that device. So it's really, we're just trying to catch up to the tech that already exists. And I will mention as well, I feel like I'm being very negative, but I do realize that this is an education thing mostly, and that people don't know about digital accessibility. And no one is sat there in, their architecture design meeting going, I don't want blind people to use this. So I do want to just mention that because I feel like this has been a very serious talk. So yeah, I guess that's why iLabs exist and why I'm here. We're just trying to spread that awareness and get accessibility into actual policy and into your sprints and that kind of thing, and really get it into a global thing. I'll mention legislation briefly because I think it's been one of the most impactful things in increasing digital accessibility. America kind of came first accidentally. They had the American for Disability Act in 1973, before the internet existed, but it is kind of covered mostly because of Domino's, and I do mean Domino's the pizza. If any of you order as much Domino's as me, you'll know that you only get the deals online. And guess what? Their website and app don't work with a screen reader. So there was a blind American guy who sued them in 2019, and Domino's very embarrassingly fought it all the way to the Supreme Court, like literally appealed for like 4 years. $1 million company did not want to spend 10 grand fixing their website, and argued that because the internet didn't exist when the law was created, they should be allowed to discriminate against people. Either way, they did lose, which has been great since then. Like, I think last year there was 10,000 lawsuits in America against digital discrimination. And it has really brought up an uptake in digital accessibility in America. And there is, like, Europe is kind of following along now. So UK brought in their law in 2018 for public sector bodies. And then the EU brought in theirs in 2020 for public sector as well. And in 2025, the EU is making it even bigger. It's going to cover banking, e-commerce, transport, e-books, TVs, all sorts of things. And people will have the right to sue as well against discrimination. And I think that hopefully that will make quite a big impact. The reason I'm specifically mentioning it to you is because it covers any sites that trade in the EU. So even say Tesco, they have e-commerce on their site and they do have an Irish version of their site. They will have to be compliant, although they're a British company. And so I think we're going to gain a lot more in digital accessibility. Now I've got to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So I talked a lot about the issue. These are the solution, I guess. So this is the international standard for web accessibility. We're on version 2.1 right now. And there's 4 kind of sections in it. It's pan-disability, there's about 78 guidelines, and it just means that your website will be completely compatible with everyone's devices or assistive needs. So the first section is kind of perceivable. So is all information understandable regardless of what sense you have? Operable, can it be navigated by everyone even if you don't use a standard keyboard and mouse? Understandable, is all the info clear? And robust, can you use it with a variety of devices and assistive technologies. And also that's a picture of the refreshable braille display that I was talking about. So you see it's just kind of like a keyboard, but it has the little white dots are the braille that pop up. And that's really cool. Alt text, I mentioned putting alt text on images, but people ask me an awful lot, how much info do I actually have to put in? So I have a kind of good and bad example. So the good example is a family having a picnic under a tree. A bad example would be something vague like just picnic, or even if you just named it like, I've seen a lot of like event 2020, like galleries of images from events. That's not descriptive enough. But as well, you don't need to go to the point where you're describing the shaft of light that's breaking through the trees. My rule of thumb is, what are you trying to convey to sighted users? Are you trying to show that your CEO met some important person? Name them then. Are you a clothing shop? Describe the clothes. What are you actually trying to convey by putting that image there? And put that in the alt text then, so everyone has the same access to the information that you're trying to show. I have accessible videos as well. So there's 2 kind of groups you have to think about when it comes to videos. The first is hard of hearing. There's 2 guidelines around there. You have your basic required guideline, which is just subtitles. And then you have the AAA guidelines, which are kind of they're not needed under any legislation. We want to be extra perfect, and that would be including a sign language interpreter. And then for sight loss, you have audio description or a different media alternative. So you can put in audio description. If you don't have the resources for that, a text transcript is good, even if you just link it below. And it's everything that's spoken, but also anything that is conveyed visually. If you're doing a demo, you would describe that. If you have image, text coming across the screen, you would describe that. If you have like a silly little background of like some rolling hills, it's okay. That's just for aesthetic purposes. You don't have to add that. But videos, usually very inaccessible, quite easy to make accessible. Color contrast is another one. So there are set requirements, ratios that I have in the text there. No one really understands ratios, but if you Google color contrast checker, you will get little tools like this where you put in a hex code or you have a little dropper and it gives you a little pass or fail. And they have like WCAG, AA, that's what you would be aiming for. And you just want a little pass mark. And you even have little sliders you can move around to make sure your color contrast is good enough. Plugins and automated tools, I just wanted to mention, because I know a lot of people use like kind of automated checkers. They're kind of built into all Microsoft products as well. They won't catch everything. It is good to at least do that, but if you're paying for something that's going to magically fix your website and make it perfect, it's not going to be 100% there. It's probably going to catch 30 or 40%, but things like keyboard navigation, there's nothing out there right now that picks that up completely, and the context won't be there either. So if you have, an image of a dog and it's labeled Adela at Women Techmakers, the automated tool will tell you, good job. But it's not, it's a dog. So that's why I would really recommend doing some sort of manual auditing for your accessibility. Okay, I've got to the actual, the actual research. So we did look at Northern Ireland and their level of digital accessibility, specifically across government departments, local authorities, housing, education, health, utilities, all the kind of, bare minimum necessities and fundamental human rights that are kind of provided. And this report actually technically isn't launched yet, so you're the first to see any results from this. But if you do want to read it when it's out, email me and I'll add you to like our newsletter list or something, and then you can read the whole document. Just a note as well, our benchmark for this was just like usable. It wasn't like full compliance. It was like, I can use this with a range of assistive technology. I think that's important. The first place we looked at was the top employers. So about 5% of Northern Ireland's workforce work in these 10 companies. And only about 30% of them fail or pass, Asda, Spirit Aerosystems and BT. And as I said, like usable. They still had issues. The others were like completely, you just like couldn't use certain things if you had certain assistive needs. We looked at government departments as well. They are required to be, they are under the legislation, they are required to be accessible. And we did pass them, all of them, which is really good. But again, like I said, they still had some issues. They were usable. We looked at local authorities as well. Obviously, they provide kind of public services and stuff in their communities. They also have to be compliant, and we passed 9 out of the 11. So still kind of good figures so far. Should be expected of the government, but anyway. Housing, terrible, honestly. We looked at the 5 biggest, and only 1 passed. The rest were just too bad. They're too inaccessible, and it's kind of terrible because they all have like, oh, you can get assistive, or, accessible rooms. We'll cater for people with disabilities. We've certain houses, so on. They can't apply. They can't look at them. They can't access your website. They can't contact you. It's not like, it's just important as giving equal access to housing in the first place. We looked at education as well. It is a fundamental right for every child in Northern Ireland. So we took 2 secondary and 2 primary from every single county. About 42% of secondary schools passed and about 30% of primary schools. So again, quite low figures. That does mean that most parents with disabilities would not be able to sign up their kids for school, pick their dietary requirements, see feedback from teachers. And again, the students themselves probably also would not be able to see feedback from teachers. They'd struggle even seeing homework because some people put homework all on a kind of e-learning platform now. We did healthcare as well. There's 6 health and social care trusts in Northern Ireland 5 out of the 6 passed, so that's pretty good. But obviously there's a massive amount of hospitals and so on as well that we didn't look into. But they also have to be compliant. So you can kind of see a trend of the legislation actually kind of working, which is good and why I think it's so important, especially across something like healthcare, because obviously people with disabilities do require more healthcare and better access to healthcare. So at least being able to read things on the website is like, you know, bare minimum. Anyway, local authorities. Oh, sorry, I forgot to change the heading on that one. That's meant to say utility providers. But we looked at electricity, water, gas. Only water is government owned, but obviously all of them are essential services. They should be accessible anyway. And the only one that passed was NIE Networks, the electricity one. So in conclusion, Northern Ireland is making progress. And definitely compared to, like, you know, before the legislation came in. But there is still a long way to go before we fully end digital discrimination. And hopefully every organisation will eventually take this on board and just incorporate it into all of their policies. But this is my last slide, and I'm going to end on one line. And that is that disability was never the issue. The issue has always been society's lack of accessibility. So, thank you. Do people have questions? That's okay. Do feel free to email me or visit our website as well if you want any support with your digital accessibility. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Adela.